We are all chasing knockout power, and there are many things that you may be told about generating iron fists, like knockout power is genetic and you can't train it, or you just need to get stronger. While there is a shred of truth to these statements, it's far from reality, and there are many pieces to this puzzle. Now let me preface this video with not everything that you do when you're training for boxing or other striking arts, or even MMA, should be centered around developing knockout power. There are more factors involved in success, and technical and tactical factors are also half the battle. But it is an interesting problem to solve. And having this quality is never going to be a negative thing. So I'm going to break down the science of what creates a knockout punch and how to train it. But before that, I've just finished the free boxing strength conditioning blueprint. It'll be down in the description. It covers everything you need to know for strength conditioning for boxing or any other striking art. And there's also a free 7-day trial of the training app that will also be down there. But I'm going to head to my notes, because this video is going to be information overload. But by the end of it, you'll have a very clear understanding of what creates a knockout style punch, or essentially how to punch harder, and how your training should reflect that. So let's start with how knockout power is typically approached. You're typically given the equation of force equals mass times acceleration. And if you take this physics equation at face value, it will make it seem that if you can throw your fist essentially faster or with greater acceleration, which would be more accurate, you're going to hit someone harder. And I wish it was that simple, because then it would be very, very easy to develop. But I'm going to show you why it doesn't come this simple. So let's look at this graph right here. It is the anatomy of a punch, and it's data from Wes Elliott from Strike Tech Sensors. He's tested hundreds of professional UFC fighters and boxers, and I highly suggest you watch him on the Street Science Fighting podcast later on. But this shows a punch from the moment the boxer decides to throw it to the point of impact and the follow through. Now the first thing you should actually notice is just how quickly this punch is thrown. We're looking at maybe like 0.13 of a second between throwing the punch and impact. It's 130 milliseconds, which is very, very quick to be able to generate the speed and the force needed. But let's get into the nitty gritty of this graph. Essentially, it's acceleration over time. So we see the beginning of the punch, which has been clearly labeled, and this is where it all starts, right where the toe meets the time axis. Then we'll start with the beginning of the punch, which is clearly labeled on the graph. And following that, we have the magnitude of acceleration. This is the y-axis on the left. The graph shows how fast the acceleration builds up and cools down. And this is the magnitude of the acceleration. It goes up as the punch speeds up and comes down as the punch slows down. So you can see with the black line, acceleration, the speed of the punch increases until it peaks, leading into impact. We then have the toe, which is the first part of the acceleration curve. And right before the plateau, there's a dip on the graph known as the toe. It's where the punch is just about to rev up. We have the plateau, which is just before the punch reaches its peak. There's this little flat high region on the graph, and it's like the boxer is gathering up for a big hit. Then we have the engagement point. This is where the punch starts getting serious. It's where the acceleration begins to really ramp up. As you can see, this big spike in that black line. And then disengagement, which is after the impact. You can see how quickly the hand is accelerated in such short time frames just from this little graph. So what happens when you compare punches from different fighters and different styles? So here's some more data from Wes. This graph is really, really nice to kind of illustrate the point. The orange line, which has the biggest spike, as you can see in acceleration, shows a snapping style punch, kind of like in karate point fighting, where the punch snaps at the target. The green line shows a boxing style punch that drives through the target before snapping back. So while the orange line had the higher peak in deceleration, the green line led to a punch that could cause more damage. And this illustrates that a higher acceleration doesn't always mean a stronger punch. And I've got some research to show you in a little bit on that. Now it's the combination of a high rate of deceleration with a good follow through that can make a punch more effective. Just pushing through the target to get a longer follow through won't have a stronger impact. There needs to be a snap, but it should be timed well to allow for a good follow through. A punch with high acceleration and impact and a solid follow through, just hitting through the bag or opponent, makes the force spike last longer, covering more area under the curve, which is the shaded area. And this area under the curve is known as impulse. And put simply, impulse is force multiplied by time. Now, time is typically constrained in sport. And as you can see, as I mentioned before, if you're pushing to follow through the target too long, you're going to increase time, but at the expense of the acceleration to be able to generate higher forces. Now, what's also important is that there's an impulse momentum relationship, and that is force times time equals mass times velocity. And mass times velocity is just the equation for momentum. And I will cover these a little more in a second, but I just wanted to give you that little bit of background. The blue line shows what I talked about just before, where if you follow through too long without good acceleration impact, the force transferred to the opponent won't be as much as there is less impulse. Remember, more impulse equals more momentum, and we want to transfer as much momentum as possible to the target. Now, this impact force is known as effective mass. Now, leading punch researcher Seth Linetsky has talked about this extensively on the Sweet Science of Fighting podcast, which I highly recommend you also check out after this video. But what is effective mass? So Seth and his colleagues, they reference anecdotal evidence from the one and only Bruce Lee. He emphasizes the importance of relaxing the body as you strike, tensing the last possible moment before impact. Similarly, Jack Dempsey states that punches would be thrown as relaxed as possible, only becoming frozen and steel hard at impact. Both of these are elite martial artists, and without them knowing, were referring to increasing the effective mass of their strikes, improving the ability to transfer the momentum throughout the body to the intended target. And we can take a quote from Seth's study here. If an athlete is able to relax their arm throughout a strike and then stiffen their arm at the last possible moment, theoretically that strike could impact with greater force than one thrown with constant activation or stiffness. If an athlete were a solid, uniformly block of mass, so think about just like a large box being thrown at someone, then the calculation of punching impact force would be easy because you would just plug that into force equals mass times acceleration. But athletes are made of multiple moving segments with both rigid, which would be bone, and soft structures, which would be muscle, tendons, etc. This is important as soft structures can deform at impact, coined as wobbling mass. Now, wobbling mass cannot transmit impact forces as effectively as rigid mass, so your ability to punch hard is directly affected. The greater the rigidity of the impact mass, which would be arm, trunk, legs, the less elastic the collision is. The less elastic the collision, the greater the momentum, which means the greater the impulse. This is all impacted on the target. Take, for example, this will be a really easy visualization, swinging two objects at someone. Start with a pool noodle. You swing it as hard as possible, and due to the soft mass of the pool noodle, at impact the noodle wraps around the target, and at the point of impact the noodle deforms and creates a slight indent. Now do the same thing with a wooden bat. When swung at the target at the same velocity as the pool noodle, the stick is rigid and can transfer more momentum to the target due to its greater effective mass. Effective mass is just simply used to quantify the impacts of this wobbling mass in humans. So if we refer back to Seth Linetsky's research, they found that increasing muscle co-contractions, which is just opposing muscle groups both contracting simultaneously, increasing the joint stability, can reduce the deformation during impact, allowing for greater effective mass and a more brutal punch. Now, co-contractions are something that you develop almost like a skill within a movement. So, for example, when someone starts lifting weights, they don't have this ability to stabilize certain joints, and they, among many other things, they cannot lift as heavy. As they get better at the skill, they start developing these co-contractions to protect the joint and keep it stable. For example, when squatting, you have co-contractions around the hip, and that'll allow you to squat heavy loads. Now, for speed, not such a great adaptation, but there's more to this idea of co-contractions and having this kind of last minute stiff impact. Additionally, the more segments involved in a movement, the greater the potential to enhance effective mass. So I'm just throwing with my arm, I'm not gonna have as much momentum transfer to the target as if I'm actually using my hips and my legs with it. And I've got some research on that for you too coming. A really easy example, just like I mentioned there, stepping forward during a jab would increase the impact force compared to just throwing the arm. And at the start of the impact, two aspects of the punch need to be satisfied to transfer momentum. Firstly, all joints supporting the impact need to be stiffened, which we've already talked about, to prevent the collapse of the joint or wobbling mass. And secondly, it is theorized that to maximize the effectiveness of a punch, an additional force needs to be added during the time of impact. They also state that force needs to be timed carefully to coincide with the deceleration of the impact, and this is the only time force may be effectively applied. Force applied after impact could be theorized to push at the target rather than deform it. And this leads us to a critical neuromuscular phenomenon, thought to cause changes in effective mass, and that is the double peak muscle activation phenomenon. Now, Seth stated on the podcast that this may not be as important for high impact force punching compared to effective mass, as there are many ways or many styles of punching, and all that matters at the end is really having that stiffening impact. Now, double peak muscle activation is something that is going to help you improve or at least maximize effective mass, so we're going to cover it. Now, it's a striking technique that has been found in elite mixed martial artists, and it refers to the muscle groups activating, relaxing, and then reactivating, hence the double peak. And if you've watched any of my previous videos on this channel, you know how much I've harped on about activation, relaxation kinetics, which we are going to cover on this video too. But the first peak occurs as the punch is initiated, and the relaxation period occurs throughout the movement until the second peak in activation moments before impact. It has been claimed to occur because of the velocity needed to appropriately interact with an opponent. And this is important because I talked about co-contractions before being a negative impact on speed. This would be the opposite, because if you had the co-contractions, you're not going to be able to facilitate that speed and you're going to facilitate that relaxation. Force-velocity relationship shows that velocity and force are inversely related, meaning that as velocity increases, force decreases during multi-joint movements. For example, as you start to add load to a squat, the velocity decreases even though you're trying to push the weight as fast as possible. The double peak muscle activation may be a way to circumvent the inherent limitations in the force-velocity relationship and result in a punch that maximizes velocity and force simultaneously. And there are ways that you can train to actually have high forces and high velocities, such as eccentric training, but that's a story for another time. What is interesting to note is that double peak muscle activation occurs in trained and untrained individuals. However, the second peak occurs much earlier from non-trained individuals and lasts much longer. Therefore, non-trained individuals will intuitively stiffen the joints to brace for anticipated impact and protect the limbs, and the early activation will tend to slow the velocity of the punch and thereby reducing the effective mass. Again, slow the velocity, we have less momentum to impart onto the target. A high-level martial artist will tense at the moment of impact and continue to push through the impact to deliver a harder punch. And this is believed to separate the novice from the expert fighter. And we can go even deeper with this latest paper by, I'm going to butcher this name, Kapazak and colleagues on the biomechanics of punching. And they had subjects perform a variety of punches against a force plate while wearing sensors to measure the acceleration of the hand. They found impulse decreases as acceleration increases, suggesting that overly fast punches may limit force transfer efficiency. And if we go back to Wes's graph, you see that in a visual representation with the fast snappy punch of the orange line having less impulse. Now they go on to find in the study that the jab had the highest impulse value, followed closely by the cross, indicating the jab maintains force application over a more extended duration. This may explain why experienced boxers often quote-unquote hold their fist on the target for a fraction of a second instead of delivering punches with unchecked speed. And they found that effective mass is the strongest predictor of punching force. This further supports the idea that straight punches allow for a more efficient transfer of body mass into impact as they maximize force through proper kinetic chain use. This allows the force generated by leg and hip movement to be efficiently transmitted through the torso and arm to the fist, maximizing the effective mass of the punch. While acceleration plays an important role, impulse allows for better mass transfer during impact. So if we remember from Seth's research, the more segments involved in a movement, the greater the potential to enhance effective mass. Again, showing that you need to have good coordination from the lower body to the upper body when throwing the punch. It suggests that boxers should focus on optimizing joint stiffness at the moment of impact, rather than merely increasing force or speed. And boxers who effectively utilize pressure force through the dynamic leg extension and proper body stabilization can significantly increase their effective punching mass even with relatively low body weight. Let me show you what this actually looks like in terms of data. We see in one of the earliest studies, if not the earliest, which looked at contributions of punching forces in different levels of boxers, between experienced, intermediate, and novice, and different styles of boxers, knockout artists, players, and speedsters. They identified 3 different components of an effective punch: the arm musculature into the target, the rotation of the trunk, and the drive off the ground by the legs. And this table kind of shows you what people mean when you should be involving your entire body, and especially your lower body. Experienced boxers have more significant contributions from the legs compared to other levels of boxers and compared to arm and trunk contributions. They also showed less arm musculature involvement compared to other boxing levels and compared to trunk and leg contribution, which again, likely shows some of that double pec muscle activation where they're able to facilitate more speed and not be stiff as they're throwing. And in regards to styles, knockout artists had more significant contributions from the legs compared to players and speedsters, along with a higher contribution than the trunk and the arms. So again, the lower body is one of the key components for actually generating that force and impulse, but it's that stiffening to be able to actually transfer what is happening from the ground. So how do we train to enhance punch impact force or effective mass? More time striking will be your number one thing. It's going to be time doing the sport, especially hitting the heavy bag. Heavy bag is probably your primary tool for developing effective mass within the specific skill of punching. You can use it as a conditioning tool through some form of interval training or some form of technical training. This is your effective mass development. Other options are end range isometric, so holding essentially your jab out in front and pushing against an immovable object and creating that stiffness at the end range. But they are a smaller part of the equation. And we can still improve other physical qualities to assist with punching power, which is what I really want to cover here because I don't want to go into technical details because that is not my area of expertise. Taking this data at face value that we've talked about, we could just say improve lower body strength and power and you're going to be able to punch harder. Sure, that might be part of the equation, but one, it can be taken too far, and two, it doesn't take into account everything else. What we really want to facilitate is appropriate activation relaxation kinetics. And I've covered this in a previous video, which I will actually link at the end screen of this video, but I'll give you the shortened version of it here because I think it's important to cover as part of this kind of knockout punch data. So to set the stage, we'll start with this excellent paper by Jamie Douglas, Angus Ross, and James Martin in sprint cycling. And let's start with some extracts from that paper. As pedaling rate increases during cycling, a greater proportion of the duty cycle becomes occupied by the processes of activation and relaxation. Activation relaxation kinetics becomes increasingly critical to maximizing positive work and minimizing negative work. Now think of positive work as just pushing down on the pedal from 12 o'clock to 6 o'clock. Negative work is kind of the recovery, 6 o'clock to 12 o'clock. Even if rates of force development are high, the minimum time required to activate and relax muscle will compromise the attainment of maximum force and the total work that can be produced during a pedal cycle. Basically just saying there's only so much force that you can produce in such short time frames. And if you think about the short time frames you need to produce force while punching, which was that 0.13 shown on that graph, you need to have some form of relaxation in there. The minimum time required to deactivate or relax muscle may be 4 to 6 times longer than that required to activate muscle. So accordingly, unrealized work resulting from time required to relax muscle is greater than resulting from time to activate muscle. So unrealized work in this instance is just referring to the potential power that cannot be generated because of physiological constraints. And those physiological constraints are the activation of the muscle and potentially it not being able to switch off fast enough to be able to allow that cycle to occur at higher frequencies. Within boxing, that would be throwing a punch and then being able to throw multiple different combinations and having the muscle switch off to facilitate the speed to be able to go to the next punch, next punch, next punch. Therefore, at most pedaling rates obtained within sprint cycling, the average force production over the pedal cycle will be substantially constrained by activation relaxation kinetics, with relaxation kinetics being the more prominent limiting factor. Calcium handling kinetics and cross-bridge cycling rates are the primary determinants of activation relaxation kinetics and are primarily fiber type dependent. Don't worry, I'm going to break all this down. Calcium kinetics directly influences cross-bridge cycling rate. And yes, sounds like a bunch of gibberish, but I'm going to put it very simply. Two protein filaments in the muscle that slide past each other and they bind together, causing the muscle to contract. For them to bind, they need a switch, which is calcium. It binds to a little protein that kind of spirals around it. It then moves away. These proteins can bind together. The better the calcium sensitivity, the faster you can activate and relax, and the more force you can produce for longer. So keep that in mind as we continue. It seems that force-based determinants of power production are more modifiable with training. So just think of like getting stronger and producing more force than velocity and frequency-based determinants, which would be things like the activation relaxation kinetics, coordination, the speed of contraction. Excessive attention to heavy and slow strength training in the absence of explosive movements seems to be suboptimal for power production, especially during cyclic tasks at high movement frequencies due to a slowing of relaxation kinetics. Very important, because if you go on a program like starting strength of 5x5, you're doing exactly this. You're blunting those relaxation kinetics through just pure slow strength training. And this brings me to a 2019 paper by Tang and Martin, who compared 24 weeks of heavy squatting 3 times a week at 70 to 100% of 1RM, including periods of eccentric overload, with an explosive training group. And the explosive training group just performed 5 jumping exercises with body weight and additional load 3 times a week. This graph shows the results of those. It shows ABC, which is 1 Hz, 2 Hz, and 3 Hz in terms of frequency. 2 Hz is equivalent to 120 RPMs, which is about 250 milliseconds to produce force, or 500 milliseconds to do the whole cycle. 3 Hz is close to 180, 190 RPMs, which is stupid fast, which is about 150 milliseconds to produce force, which is very similar to the punch graph I showed you earlier. In short, heavy strength training, which is the solid gray line, produced the greatest positive peak power, which you can see, but also led to the greater negative work, especially at faster speeds, which you can see in graph C, which is our frequency or time to produce force that is most similar to throwing a punch. It means there's greater deceleration during the later portion of the cycle and reduced positive power production during the subsequent stroke due to the braking effect during the recovery phase. Again, coming back to our power production being impaired by the physiological constraint of not being able to relax fast enough. We can add to this that double peak muscle activation is an activation relaxation phenomenon. Now, explosive training, which is the black dashed line, showed moderate improvements in positive work without significantly increasing negative work. It also increased the power frequency relationship by 16 to 18% versus the heavy strength training group, which is basically more power at faster speeds, which means more force generated at faster speeds. So if we take all of this data and bring it all together into a very simple framework, it means that your training should be centered around explosive style training with some maximal strength work sprinkled in. Now, if you're brand new to the gym and you have no other strength training background around you, you're pretty much gonna ignore most of this. You need some general strength under you. Just doing some basic general strength training isn't going to have these negative effects just because you're so new. But as you start getting through your training career and you're looking to further improve, or at least be, I guess, quote unquote, more quote unquote specific to your boxing, you will need to start making some changes around the training program to be able to facilitate some of these adaptations that you're looking for. Now, eccentric overload creates structural adaptations needed to facilitate speed and offset the potentially negative speed effects of high volume training. And due to the short time frames for producing force when punching, anything we can do to enhance rate of force development is key. And that just means essentially anything explosive. Jumping, throwing, Olympic lifts to some extent, plyometrics. These are all activities that are gonna help you increase force production in shorter time frames. Again, as I mentioned before with the eccentric overload, another way to structurally make changes to do that, even long duration isometrics at long muscle lengths are gonna create these structural adaptations within the muscle to be able to enhance contractile velocity. And then we can also get to sprint interval training, which would be considered more conditioning. But again, everything you do is strength training because everything you do is against resistance. And sprint intervals should likely be your predominant conditioning option due to its ability to improve calcium sensitivity, which again, some of our activation relaxation within type 2 muscle fibers, and therefore help improve your speed. And of course, you get all the various peripheral adaptations from sprint intervals that you need for your conditioning. Now, in my opinion, you can get away with far less heavy lifting or traditional strength training than other combat sports. It means you could have a program heavily skewed to more jumping and throwing and maybe even lightly loaded jumps with a very low volume of heavy strength training and have great success doing that, and even have it more conditioning focused into the sprint intervals as some of your main power work versus going down the opposite road and running something like a 5x5 training program. Again, if you're a complete beginner, take a lot of this with a grain of salt. Make sure you get the Boxing Strength Conditioning Blueprint. I will give you some examples in that document. Also, you make sure you watch this video next because it actually goes really deep into this activation relaxation kinetics and details how much you really need to lift.